The sound was not the sharp, clean crack of a stone shattering against granite. It was a wet, heavy thud, the sound of 1,000 pounds of sodden leather and rotted meat hitting the cobblestones of the Genoese citadel. For the defenders of Caffa, huddled behind the limestone walls of their Crimean outpost in the autumn of 1346, the projectiles raining down from the Mongol trebuchets were no longer boulders, they were bodies. The Golden Horde, decimated by a mysterious and gruesome pestilence that turned the groin and armpits into blackened, pulsing knots of agony, had found a way to turn their own dead into their final apocalyptic weapon. As the corpses of Mongol soldiers soared through the salt-misted air, trailing the stench of liquefying organs, they brought with them a microscopic passenger that would, within 3 years, rewrite the DNA of the human race. Inside the city, the Genoese merchants, men who had built an empire on the cold calculus of spice and silk, watched in paralyzed horror as the sky filled with their enemies' remains. Gabriele de Mussi, a chronicler who would later record these events with a quill that seemed to shake on the parchment, described the scene as a rain of poisonous filth. The Italians scrambled to dump the bodies back into the sea, the waves of the Euxine Sea turning a muddy, sickly gray as the infected flesh dissolved in the surf. But the air was already heavy with the invisible. The fleas had already begun to leap from the cooling Mongol pelts to the warm, living skin of the Italian sailors. The siege was failing, but the war was already won. Janibeg, the Khan of the Golden Horde, sat in his silk-lined tent miles away, his own breath likely coming in the ragged, bloody gasps of the dying. He was a man of immense ambition, the ruler of a splintered empire, and in his final act of spite against the stubborn Europeans, he had inadvertently initiated the most efficient delivery system for mass death in human history. He didn't need to breach the walls anymore. He only needed the wind to blow and the rats to run. By the time the Genoese galleys cut their moorings and fled the harbor of Caffa, the sailors were already walking ghosts. They rowed with the rhythmic, desperate strength of men who believed they were leaving the nightmare behind, unaware that the nightmare had crawled into the very grain of their ship's timber. The galleys were marvels of 14th century engineering, sleek, fast, and packed with the riches of the East. Pepper from the Malabar coast, ginger, silks that felt like water between the fingers. But beneath the floorboards, in the dark, damp bilges where the bilge waters sloshed with every roll of the sea, the black rats, Rattus rattus, were feasting on spilled grain and multiplying. The voyage across the Black Sea toward the Mediterranean was a slow-motion funeral procession. In the cramped quarters below deck, the first symptoms appeared not as a roar, but as a whimper. A sudden chill that no wool blanket could warm, a headache that felt like a hot iron spike driven through the temples, and then the buboes. These were the physical manifestations of the Yersinia pestis bacterium, nodes the size of apples, hard to the touch, turning from an angry red to a necrotic black. If they burst, the smell was so foul that it was said to cause those nearby to faint. If they didn't, the poison simply backed up into the bloodstream, liquefying the lungs until the victim coughed up a bright arterial blood. To the medieval mind, this wasn't just biology, It was the literal breath of God exhaled in judgment. The ships reached the port of Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. The Sicilians, seeing the familiar Genoese banners, rushed to the docks to greet the wealthy merchants. They expected news of the East and crates of cinnamon. Instead, they found a floating charnel house. Of the crew that had left Caffa, barely a handful remained standing, their hands shaking as they threw the lines to the shore. The Sicilians, realizing too late that the death was on board, tried to drive the ships back out to sea with flaming arrows and stones. But it was already over. A few rats had already scurried down the ropes, disappearing into the dark alleys of the port.
In Piacenza, Gabriele de' Musi sat in his study, the sound of the town square outside his window growing quieter by the day. He wrote of how the father would not visit the son, the wife would not care for the husband, and the priest would not hear the confession of the dying. The social fabric of Europe, the feudal bonds, the religious certainties, the very idea of neighborly love was dissolving as quickly as the flesh on a plague victim's bones. The scale of the disaster, he wrote, his voice echoing through the centuries, is such that the human mind cannot grasp. We are waiting for the end of the world. But the world wasn't ending. It was being violently, agonizingly reborn. As the plague moved north, it began to encounter a Europe that was already on the brink, overpopulated, malnourished after a series of crop failures, and locked in the senseless violence of the 100 Years' War. The bacterium didn't care for the titles of kings or the sanctity of popes. It was a perfect democrat, striking the bishop in his palace and the serf in his hovel with the same clinical indifference. The narrative of the Black Death is often told as a story of numbers, 25 million dead, a third of the population gone. But the true story lies in the granular moments of betrayal. In Avignon, the seat of the papacy, Pope Clement VI sat in his private chambers, surrounded by two massive bonfires that burned day and night. His physician, Guy de Chauliac, had correctly deduced that the heat might keep the corrupted air at bay, though he didn't know it was actually the heat that kept the fleas from jumping onto the Holy Father. Clement, a man of immense worldly appetites and a lover of fine wine and music, found himself the shepherd of a flock that was being slaughtered by an invisible wolf. He heard the cries of the flagellants, mobs of men who wandered from town to town, whipping their own backs until the blood sprayed the onlookers, believing that by punishing their own flesh, they might appease an angry God. He saw the rise of the poisoners' conspiracy, the horrific, baseless rumors that the Jews were poisoning the wells, leading to massacres that turned the Rhine red with blood. The Pope was trapped. If he stepped outside, he died. If he stayed inside, he watched his moral authority evaporate as the Church failed to provide the one thing the people needed, an explanation. In Paris, King Philip VI turned to the highest authority he knew, the medical faculty at the University of Paris. The king was a man of traditional, almost rigid piety, yet he possessed a frantic need for a rational explanation for why his kingdom was rotting from within. In October 1348, the most learned doctors in Christendom gathered in their heavy fur-lined robes, surrounded by the scent of old parchment and cold stone. After weeks of deliberation,
they issued a document that would become the gold standard of medieval scientific failure. They concluded that on March 20th, 1345, at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius had occurred. This celestial misalignment, they argued, had corrupted the atmosphere, drawing up poisonous vapors from the earth and sea. To a modern ear, it sounds like madness. To a medieval mind, it was the only logic available. If the stars had willed it, what could a mere man do? While the scholars debated the stars, the plague crossed the English Channel. It arrived in the summer of 1348 at a tiny, unremarkable port called Melcombe Regis, now known as Weymouth. A single sailor from Gascony stepped off a boat, his face flushed with fever, and within weeks, the Dorset countryside was a landscape of abandoned scythes and unmilked cows. The disease moved like a slow-burning fuse towards London, the most crowded, filthy, and vibrant city in the kingdom. London in 1348 was a labyrinth of overhanging timber houses, open sewers, and roughly 50,000 people living shoulder to shoulder. When the great mortality hit, the city didn't just stop, it curdled. The sound of the bells, usually a comforting rhythm of liturgical life, became a constant, maddening tolling for the dead. The authorities, paralyzed by the scale of the dying, realized that the churchyards were already overflowing. In a moment of grim foresight, Sir Walter Manny, a soldier and courtier, purchased a 13-acre plot of land in Spitalfields to serve as an emergency burial ground. It was a factory for the dead. Laborers, desperate for coin and numbed by ale, dug long, deep trenches. The bodies were not buried with the dignity of individual graves. They were stacked like cordwood, layer upon layer, separated only by a thin dusting of lime. Among those watching the world dissolve was a young clerk named Geoffrey Chaucer. He was just a child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, living in the Vintry ward of London, where the smell of wine and river mud dominated the air. He would have seen the red crosses painted on doors, the "God have mercy on us" scrawled in chalk, and the searchers, women hired to check corpses for the telltale buboes. The trauma of these years would seep into the marrow of his later work, creating a literary voice that was uniquely attuned to the frailty and earthy corruption of the human condition. By the time the plague reached its peak in London, the very concept of family had been weaponized. In a 13th century home, space was a luxury. Everyone slept in the same room, often the same bed. If one person brought the flea home, the entire household was doomed. There are records of houses where the fire was still burning in the hearth and the table was set for dinner, but every occupant was a cold, blackened corpse in their bed. As the death toll climbed, the labor market underwent a violent, unintended revolution. For centuries, the feudal system had been built on a surplus of cheap, desperate labor. The serf was tied to the land, an appendage of the lord's estate. But suddenly, there were more fields than hands to plow them. The survivors, the lucky ones who had watched their neighbors die, realized they held a new, dangerous power: leverage. A plowman who had earned pennies before the plague now demanded shillings. If a lord refused, the plowman simply walked away to the next manor, where the desperate master would pay anything to save his harvest. This was the birth of the middle class, born not of ideology, but of a biological vacuum. King Edward III tried to stop it,
passing the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which legally mandated that wages stay at pre-plague levels. It was the first time a government tried to freeze an entire economy by decree. It failed spectacularly. The peasants had tasted agency, and they were not going back.
But while the economy shifted, the psyche of Europe was fracturing. In the streets of London and Bristol, the flagellants arrived. They were bizarre, terrifying spectacle. Hundreds of men, stripped to the waist, marched in double file, singing mournful hymns. At a signal, they would drop to their knees and strike themselves with level whips tipped with iron spikes. The spikes were designed to hook into the flesh and pull. The blood would fly, splattering the robes of the onlookers who knelt to catch the holy droplets on their clothes. They believed they were recreating the suffering of Christ to divert God's wrath. For a few weeks, they were seen as heroes, as martyrs. But as the plague continued to kill, regardless of the blood spilled, the mood turned. The Pope, fearing their growing political power and lack of clerical control, eventually declared them heretics. In the midst of this spiritual and physical carnage, a strange psychological phenomenon began to root: the danse macabre, the dance of death. It appeared in murals, in poems, and in the very way people walked the streets. The core message was simple and brutal. No matter your rank, the skeleton waits for you. The obsession with death wasn't just a byproduct of the plague. It was a coping mechanism for a generation that had seen the impossible. In the monastery of St. Albans, the chronicler Thomas Walsingham recorded how the very air seemed to change. He described the stink of the world. It wasn't just the smell of decay. It was the smell of an old world dying and a new, colder, more individualistic one being born. The survivors were often richer, inheriting the lands and goods of their entire extended families, but they carried a weight of silence that no amount of gold could lift. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the idea that the universe was orderly. If the best doctors were wrong, if the Pope was hiding behind fires, and if the most pious monks died as fast as the most wicked thieves, then what was left? As 1349 bled into 1350, the first wave began to recede, leaving behind a scarred, empty continent. But the bacterium was not gone. It was merely retreating into its rodent reservoirs, waiting for the next generation to forget the smell of the smoke and the sound of the carts. And in the ruins of the old order, the survivors began to look at the world and each other with a new, terrifyingly modern clarity. The silence that followed the first wave was not the peace of a concluded war, but the hollow ringing in the ears after an explosion. Across the English countryside, the harvest of 1351 stood rotting in the fields, a golden waste. In the great halls of the nobility, the tapestries fluttered in drafts because there were no servants to mend the window panes or stoke the hearths. But in the cottages of the survivors, a strange, feverish transformation was underway. For the first time in memory, a commoner had a surplus of silver. A plowman named Robert, who had survived while his brothers were tipped into a lime pit, found himself the sole heir to 3 family plots.
He stood in the mud of a damp Tuesday morning, looking at his hands. They were the same calloused hands, but they now held a terrifying new value. When the local bailiff demanded he perform his customary labor on the Lord's domain, Robert didn't bow. He didn't even look up from his own furrows. "I have my own wheat to bind," he told the man, his voice steady. "And if you want my help with the Lord's, it will cost you 3 times the usual rate." This was the birth of a new insolence. The ruling class responded with the fury of a wounded predator. In 1363, the English Parliament passed the Sumptuary Laws, a desperate attempt to put the genie back in the bottle. They decreed that no servant or laborer could wear cloth costing more than 2 marks, nor could they wear gold, silver, or silk. The law was a confession. The poor were now wealthy enough to dress like the rich. The dead had left behind a mountain of clothes, and the living were trying them on for size, literally and metaphorically. But as the survivors began to enjoy the bitter fruits of their inheritance, the sky darkened again. In 1361, the wind changed. The pestis secunda, the second plague, hit Europe with a cruel, surgical precision. If the first wave had been a scythe that took everyone, the second was a dagger aimed at the heart of the future. It became known as the mortalité des enfants, the plague of the children. Those who had been born after 1348 had no immunity. The bacteria tore through the nurseries and schoolrooms of Europe. In a world where half of all children already died before reaching adulthood, this was a final, crushing blow. The chronicler Jean de Venette recorded that the survivors of the first wave, thinking they were safe, watched in renewed horror as their only heirs were snatched away. It felt like a divine correction, as if the universe were reclaiming the bonus years it had granted the survivors. In the midst of this recurring nightmare, the very architecture of Europe began to change. Work on the great cathedrals, projects intended to span centuries, simply ground to a halt. At Siena, the massive expansion of the Duomo was abandoned. The stone blocks, already carved and ready for the vaulting, were left where they lay, eventually becoming overgrown with moss and ivy. The perpendicular style emerged in England, a harder, more rigid, and less ornamental form of Gothic. It was an architecture of mourning, stripped of the exuberant carvings of the early century.
But the most profound change was taking place in the minds of the people. The church, which had failed to stop the dying, was no longer the undisputed gateway to the divine. In the 1360s, a scholar at Oxford named Wycliffe began to voice what many were whispering in the alehouses, that the church was too wealthy, too corrupt, and that the individual didn't need a priest to talk to God. He began translating the Bible into English, the vulgar tongue. This was a revolutionary act. To give the peasant the word of God in their own language was to give him a weapon. If a man could read the law of God himself, why did he need a bishop who lived in a palace? Wycliffe's followers, the Lollards, began to spread these ideas through the countryside, moving like the plague itself, invisible, potent, and transformative. They met in secret, in barns and forest clearings, lit by the moon and the fire of a new, dangerous conviction.
As the 1370s dawned, the tension between the ruling class and the emboldened workforce reached a breaking point. King Edward III, the aging hero of Crécy, was fading, and his son, the Black Prince, was dying of dysentery. The government was broke from the endless wars in France and desperate for cash. In 1377, they introduced a poll tax, a flat fee for every head in the kingdom, from the wealthiest duke to the poorest widow. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. To a peasant who had seen the world end and yet survived, who had seen his wages rise and his spirit grow, this tax was more than an economic burden. It was an insult to his newfound dignity. The collectors who rode out into the villages of Kent and Essex were no longer met with bowed heads. They were met with questions, then with stones, and finally with the sharpened edges of long-abandoned war bills. In the village of Fobbing, a man named Thomas Baker looked the royal commissioner in the eye and refused to pay. He didn't speak for himself, he spoke for the village. When the commissioner threatened him with the king's justice, the village rose. They chased the officials out, and the spark hit the dry tinder of 30 years of resentment. The peasants' revolt had begun, led not by a king or a lord, but a man named Wat Tyler and a radical priest named John Ball, who asked the question that would haunt the aristocracy for centuries. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The march on London was not an organized rabble. These were men who had served in the wars, men who understood logistics and discipline. They burned the records of their servitude, the manorial rolls that tracked their debts and their duties. They didn't want to destroy the kingdom. They wanted to burn the paper walls that kept them imprisoned in their own lives. As they approached the capital, the young King Richard II, only 14 years old, stood on the battlements of the Tower of London. He looked out at the horizon and saw the smoke of the Savoy Palace, the most luxurious house in England, belonging to his uncle John of Gaunt, rising in a black pillar. The world was upside down. The lower orders were at the gates, and they were not asking for mercy. They were demanding the end of serfdom itself. The gates of London did not fall to a battering ram. They were opened from within. The city's poor, living in the cramped, stinking tenements of Farringdon and Billingsgate, saw the approaching rebel fires and felt a surge of ancient, buried kinship. On the morning of June 13th, 1381, the drawbridge at London Bridge lowered with a tectonic groan. Wat Tyler's army poured across the Thames, a river of brown wool and rusted iron, their boots echoing like thunder against the timber shops. They were remarkably, terrifyingly disciplined. Tyler had issued a decree. They were zealots for truth and justice, not thieves. When they reached the Savoy Palace, the opulent residence of John of Gaunt, they not only looted it, they systematically destroyed it. They threw the gold plate into the river, shredded the silk tapestries, and pounded the silver jewelry into dust with hammers. One man caught pocketing a silver cup was not cheered. He was thrown into the flames of the burning hall by his own comrades. "We are seekers of truth, not common thieves," they shouted into the smoke. While the Savoy burned, a darker drama unfolded at the Tower of London. The fortress, long considered impregnable, was breached by a small, furious band of rebels. They found Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England, the man who personified the hated poll tax.
Sudbury was in the chapel, kneeling in prayer, the scent of frankincense mingling with the metallic tang of fear. They dragged him by his vestments, his aging knees scraping against the cold stone stairs. On Tower Hill, before a screaming crowd, they forced him to the block. It was a messy, amateur butchery. It took 8 strokes of the axe to sever the archbishop's head. When it finally fell, the crowd cheered not just the death of a man, but the death of the old law. They jammed his head on a pike, nailed his silk mitre to his skull, and paraded him through the streets, a gruesome mascot for the new world they intended to build.
King Richard II, a boy of 14 whose father had been the most feared knight in Europe, watched this from the battlements. His advisors, frightened men who had hidden in the tower's cellars, urged him to flee. But Richard, perhaps fueled by the desperate arrogance of the Plantagenet bloodline, did the unthinkable. He agreed to meet the rebels at Mile End. The meeting was a collision of 2 universes. On one side, a pale boy on a white horse, draped in the blue and gold of the royal house. On the other, Wat Tyler and thousands of men who smelled of the earth and the forge. Richard listened as Tyler demanded the abolition of serfdom, the end of the feudal hierarchy, and a flat rent to 4 pence per acre. In a moment of breathtaking political theater, the boy king nodded. "I grant it," he said, his voice high and clear over the murmuring crowd. He promised them charters of freedom written in the king's own hand. The rebels wept with joy. They believed they had won. They began to drift away, heading back to their villages to wait for the pieces of parchment that would make them men instead of property. But Richard was not surrendering. He was buying time. The final confrontation occurred the following day at Smithfield, a livestock market on the edge of the city. The air smelled of horse manure and damp hay. Wat Tyler, emboldened by his success at Mile End, approached the king with a swagger that bordered on the suicidal. He rinsed his mouth with water in front of the monarch and spat it out, then demanded that all the laws of the realm be changed, save for those he approved of. The tension snapped when William Walsworth, the mayor of London, stepped forward. He called Tyler a stinking knave. Tyler lunged with his dagger, but Walsworth was wearing armor beneath his robes. He drew a short sword and struck Tyler in the neck and head. As Tyler fell from his horse, another of the king's squires ran him through the belly. The rebel army, seeing their leader fall, drew their bows. Hundreds of arrows were knocked to strings. In that second, the history of England hung by a thread. Had the arrows flown, the monarchy would have died in a muddy cattle market. Instead, Richard II spurred his horse forward, riding directly into the line of fire. "I am your captain," he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. "I am your king. Follow me." The rebels, stunned by the boy's courage, or perhaps hypnotized by the divinity they had been taught to believe lived in his veins, lowered their bows. They followed him out of the city, where they were eventually surrounded by the king's mobilizing militia. The betrayal was swift and absolute. As soon as the threat had dissipated, the charters of freedom were revoked. When a delegation of peasants later came to Richard to ask for the promised liberties, the boy who had played the hero at Smithfield sneered at them. "Villains you are," he told them, "and villains you shall remain." The hangman's noose replaced the scribe's pen.
Hundreds were executed in the coming weeks, their bodies left to swing at the crossroads as a warning that the great mortality had not changed the world as they had hoped. But Richard was wrong. The world had changed. The plague had done what the rebels could not. It had broken the math of feudalism. You could hang a man, but you could not hang a labor shortage. As the 14th century drew to a close, the survivors of the Black Death and the Great Revolt lived in a haunted landscape. They were richer, they were more literate, and they were far more skeptical of their betters. The church began to lose its grip as people realized that their own prayers, spoken in English, were just as loud as a bishop's Latin. The plague had acted as a brutal biological accelerator. It had burned away the dead wood of the Middle Ages, leaving behind the seeds of the Renaissance and the Reformation. But the cost was a lingering trauma that manifested in strange ways. In the art of the 1390s, Christ is no longer a distant kingly figure. He is shown as a man of sorrows, his skin pockmarked and bleeding, mirroring the suffering of the people who knelt before him. The people of Europe had seen the end of the world, and they had found that life went on. They had learned that the stars did not control their fate, and the king's word was only as good as the steel that backed it. They were the first modern humans, defined not by their place in a divine order, but by their struggle to survive a universe that didn't care if they lived or died. The landscape of the late 14th century was a study in profound, lingering ironies. In the wake of the 1381 revolt, the English aristocracy had successfully reasserted its legal grip on the peasantry, yet the economy refused to obey the law of the gallows. The fields remained half empty, the labor remained scarce, and the price of a man's sweat continued to rise. This economic reality manifested in a new, eerie visual culture across Europe. In the cathedrals and churchyards, a new kind of monument began to appear, the transy tomb, or cadaver tomb. Unlike the noble effigies of the past, which depicted the deceased as serene, sleeping knights in full plate armor, the transy tomb was a two-story horror. On the top level, the lord or bishop was carved in his earthly glory. On the bottom, he was a rotting corpse, carved with anatomical precision, skin sagging, ribs protruding, worms crawling through the hollows of the eyes. It was a visceral reminder that the plague had leveled the human playing field. Whether you wore a silk mitre or a burlap tunic, the end was a liquid, stinking decay. While the artists obsessed over the good death, the administrators of the Mediterranean were inventing the first mechanisms of public health. In the port of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, the city council realized that the corrupted air didn't just arrive, it arrived on the ships. In 1377, they established the Trentine, a 30-day isolation period for all incoming vessels from infected areas. By the time the practice reached Venice, the period was extended to 40 days, the quarantina, from which we derive the word quarantine. Imagine the scene in the Venetian lagoon, a merchant galley, its hold heavy with cloves and nutmeg, anchored just out of reach of the docks. The sailors, seeing the lights of the city's taverns, were forbidden from stepping onto the stone piers. If a single man showed a fever, the ship was left to rot. Guards in small skiffs patrolled the waters, their torches bobbing in the mist, tasked with ensuring that the invisible killer stayed on the water. It was the first time a state had attempted to partition the world between the clean and the unclean.
In England, the boy king who had faced down the rebels at Smithfield was growing into a man of dangerous, brittle complexity. Richard II had been traumatized by the sights of his childhood, the burning of the Savoy, the murder of his advisors, the smell of the mob. He developed a philosophy of kingship that was as beautiful as it was delusional. He believed his power was not a contract with the people, but a divine rays of the sun direct from God. He surrounded himself with a curial court of poets and aesthetics, including Geoffrey Chaucer, whom he appointed as clerk of the king's works. Richard was the first king to insist on being addressed as Your Majesty or Your Highness. He invented the pocket handkerchief, a small, elegant tool to wipe away the grime of a world he increasingly despised. In his private chambers, he commissioned the Wilton diptych, a portable altarpiece where he is depicted being presented to the Virgin Mary by his patron saints. In the painting, Richard doesn't look like a king who survived a plague. He looks like a god who had forgotten the taste of dust. But the world outside his silk-lined walls was far from divine. The plague was no longer a singular event. It had become endemic. It returned in 1361, 1369, 1375, and 1390. Each time, it pruned the population further, ensuring that the survivors lived in a state of perpetual alert. This created a frantic carpe diem energy. If you could die by Tuesday, why save your coin? In the cities of Flanders and the Rhineland, a new class of people emerged, the Beggards and Beguines. These were lay people who lived in semi-monastic communities but took no permanent vows. They were a symptom of a church that had lost its monopoly on the soul. People were seeking direct, emotional connections to the divine, often through self-inflicted poverty or mystical trances. The modern devotion movement began to spread, emphasizing the inner life over the outward ritual. It was a quiet, spiritual rebellion that, a century later, would provide the fuel for Martin Luther. In England, the boy king who had faced down the rebels at Smithfield was growing into a man of dangerous, brittle complexity. Richard II had been traumatized by the sights of his childhood, the burning of the Savoy, the murder of his advisors, the smell of the mob. He developed a philosophy of kingship that was as beautiful as it was delusional. He believed his power was not a contract with the people, but a divine rays of the sun direct from God. He surrounded himself with a curial court of poets and aesthetics, including Geoffrey Chaucer, whom he appointed as clerk of the king's works. Richard was the first king to insist on being addressed as Your Majesty or Your Highness. He invented the pocket handkerchief, a small, elegant tool to wipe away the grime of a world he increasingly despised. In his private chambers, he commissioned the Wilton diptych, a portable altarpiece where he is depicted being presented to the Virgin Mary by his patron saints. In the painting, Richard doesn't look like a king who survived a plague. He looks like a god who had forgotten the taste of dust. But the world outside his silk-lined walls was far from divine. The plague was no longer a singular event. It had become endemic. It returned in 1361, 1369, 1375, and 1390.
Each time it pruned the population further, ensuring that the survivors lived in a state of perpetual alert. This created a frantic carpe diem energy. If you could die by Tuesday, why save your coin? In the cities of Flanders and the Rhineland, a new class of people emerged, the Begards and Beguines. These were lay people who lived in semi-monastic communities but took no permanent vows. They were a symptom of a church that had lost its monopoly on the soul. People were seeking direct, emotional connections to the divine, often through self-inflicted poverty or mystical trances. The modern devotion movement began to spread, emphasizing the inner life over the outward ritual. It was a quiet, spiritual rebellion that, a century later, provided the fuel for Martin Luther.
The political tension in England finally snapped in 1399. Richard II, in his hubris, had seized the lands of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt. It was the final straw for an aristocracy that had grown tired of a king who ruled by whim and aesthetic preference rather than the common law. Bolingbroke returned from exile not just to claim his inheritance, but to claim the crown. The deposition of Richard II was a scene of staggering, cold-blooded theatre. In the Great Hall of Westminster, the man who believed he was a god was forced to stand before the gathered lords and renounce his throne. He was stripped of his signet ring, his crown, and his identity. "I have been King of England these 22 years," Richard reportedly said, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief. "And now I am nothing." He was led away to the dungeons of Pontefract Castle, where he would eventually be starved to death, a king who had survived the Black Death only to be consumed by the hunger of his own people. As the 15th century dawned, the great mortality had receded into the European psyche like the low hum of a distant engine. It was no longer a shock, it was the weather. But beneath the surface, the foundations of the modern world were hardening. The labor shortage had led to the invention of labor-saving devices. In the German city of Mainz, a young man named Johannes Gutenberg was growing up in a world where the price of parchment was falling because the number of people who could read it was rising. The death of the old world was almost complete. The feudal lords were becoming landlords, the serfs were becoming tenant farmers, and the priests were becoming bureaucrats. The 14th century had begun with a famine and ended with a revolution. It had seen the sky turn black and the earth turn to a graveyard. But in the cracks of the broken stone, something new was beginning to stir. A world defined not by the stars or the blood of kings, but by the relentless, surviving spirit of the common man. The scale of the transformation was such that a man born in 1300 would not have recognized the world of 1400. It was as if the human race had been put through a sieve, and only the hardest, most adaptable grains remained. Attributed to an anonymous 15th century chronicler. The story of the Black Death is often ended at the graveside, but the true narrative is the story of what happened next. It is the story of a civilization that had its heart broken and discovered it could still beat. It is the story of us. As the bells of the 15th century began to toll, they rang over a landscape that was physically broken but economically transformed. The Great Slump, a period of mid-century economic contraction, was not a sign of failure, but a painful restructuring.
In the English Midlands and the valleys of the Cotswolds, a silent revolution was occurring. The lords, tired of haggling with defiant peasants who demanded exorbitant wages for harvesting wheat, made a cold, calculated decision. They stopped planting. Instead, they began to enclose the land. They turned to sheep. A single shepherd and his dog could manage a flock on land that previously required 50 men to plow, sow, and reap. This was the beginning of the enclosure movement, a process that would eventually drive thousands of peasants off the land and into the growing cities. Thomas More would later write with bitter irony that sheep are eating men. Vibrant villages were being erased from the map, replaced by the white, woolly waves of the textile industry. The lost villages of England, like Warham Percy, became ghost towns not because of the plague, but because of the price of wool.
In the cities, the survivors were finding new ways to spend their inherited wealth. The 1400s saw an explosion in the demand for luxury goods, but also for something more precious: information. With fewer people to copy manuscripts by hand, the cost of books remained astronomical until the plague-induced labor crisis met German metalworking. In Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg was experimenting with the technology of the wine press and the precision of the goldsmith's punch. He wasn't just inventing a machine, he was responding to a world where literacy was no longer the exclusive province of the monk. The black art of printing was born in a world that had been thinned out by the Black Death. By the mid-1400s, the first Bibles began to roll off the presses. For the first time in human history, an idea could travel faster than a flea. But the trauma of the 1340s remained etched into the collective soul. It manifested in a strange, obsessive literary genre, the ars moriendi, or the art of dying. These were illustrated how-to guides for the final hour. In a world where the plague could take you in 3 days, knowing how to resist the 5 temptations of the dying: unbelief, despair, impatience, spiritual pride, and avarice, was considered more important than knowing how to live. Families would gather around a deathbed, not in silent grief, but in a frantic, choreographed battle for the soul. They would hold up the ars moriendi woodcuts, showing the dying man a vision of heaven and hell, urging him to make a good end. Death was no longer a private moment. It was a public performance, a high-stakes drama where the prize was eternity. While Europe looked inward at its own mortality, a few men began to look outward across the Atlantic. The disruption of the Silk Road, partially due to the collapse of the Mongol Empire and the recurring plague outbreaks in the East, had made the spice trade dangerous and expensive. The Venetians and Genoese were being squeezed by the rising Ottoman Empire. In Portugal, Prince Henry, known to history as the Navigator, established a school of cartography and navigation at Sagres, on the very edge of the known world. He was a man of cold, ascetic intensity, obsessed with finding a way around the continent of Africa to reach the riches of the Indies. The caravel, a ship designed to sail into the wind, was the 14th century's equivalent of a moon rocket. The tragedy of the 13th century had left the survivors with a new kind of survivor's guilt that fueled a desperate need for beauty. This was the engine of the Renaissance. In Florence, the Medici family,
bankers whose wealth grew in the fertile soil of the post-plague economy began to pour their florins into art that celebrated the human form. If the plague had shown that the body was fragile and disgusting, the artists of the 1400s, Donatello, Masaccio, and eventually Botticelli, sought to prove that it was also divine. They returned to the classical ideals of Greece and Rome, finding in the pagan past a way to celebrate a world that was no longer purely defined by the monastery. The focus of the human gaze was shifting from the clouds of the afterlife to the light of the piazza. By the time the year 1450 arrived, Europe was a vastly different place than the one the Genoese sailors had returned to in 1347. The population was still only a fraction of what it had been, but those who lived were taller, better fed, and more likely to own the land they worked. The great mortality had been a horrific pruning, but it had also been a clearing. The stage was now set for the final collision. The medieval world, with its fixed hierarchies and its fear of the stars, was in its death throes. A new era, defined by the printing press, the caravel, and the individual conscience, was waiting to be born. But as the ships of Portugal began to inch down the coast of Africa, and as Gutenberg's press began to hum, the survivors of the Black Death knew one thing for certain: the world could end at any moment. And if it was going to end, they intended to see what lay beyond the horizon first. The year 1453 served as the ultimate punctuation mark to the Middle Ages, a year where two tectonic shifts signaled that the old walls, both literal and metaphorical, could no longer hold. In the East, the impossible happened. Constantinople, the queen of cities and the last flickering ember of the Roman Empire, fell to the cannons of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. For over 1,000 years, those walls had stood as a bulwark for Christendom. When they crumbled under the weight of modern gunpowder, the shockwaves sent Greek scholars fleeing westward to Italy, their arms heavy with ancient manuscripts of Plato and Aristotle that had been lost to the West for centuries. The fall of the city wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake. It forced the European mind to realize that the center of the world was shifting. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was becoming an Ottoman sea. The old trade routes were being choked by new masters. This forced the gaze of the West even further towards the Atlantic, towards the terrifying, unknown sea of darkness.
34. In the West, the 100 Years' War finally sputtered to a close, not with a grand treaty, but with a weary realization that the age of the knight was over. At the Battle of Castillon in 1453, French field artillery tore through the English heavy cavalry. The armored knight, the symbol of the feudal order, the man whose status was defined by the horse he rode and the land he owned, was rendered obsolete by a peasant with a matchlock and a ball of lead. The social hierarchy that the Black Death had weakened was now being physically dismantled on the battlefield. As the nobility lost their military monopoly, they retreated into a world of increasingly desperate, performative chivalry. They held tournaments that were more theater than combat, wearing armor so heavy and ornate it was useless in a real fight. They were dressing up as their ancestors, clinging to a mythology of honor, while the world of commerce and gunpowder surged past them.
But the plague never truly left. It had become a permanent ghost in the machine of European life. In 1466, a massive outbreak hit Paris, claiming 40,000 lives. In the 1480s, it struck London again. But the response was changing. It was no longer met with only prayer and flagellation, but with the cold, hard logic of the state. In Milan, the Dukes of Visconti established a permanent health office. They didn't just quarantine ships, they quarantined entire houses. When a case of plague was discovered, the doors and windows were bricked up with the family inside. Food was passed through a small hole in the wall. It was brutal, heartless, and remarkably effective. This was the birth of the biopolitical state, a government that claimed the right to regulate the very bodies of its citizens in the name of security. The individual was no longer just a soul to be saved by the church, but a biological unit to be managed by the king. In the late 15th century, a new figure emerged from the shadows of the plague-scarred landscape, the plague doctor. Though the iconic bird-like mask with the long beak would not become standardized until later, the early versions were already appearing. These men were often second-rate physicians or young men looking to make a fortune in a high-risk trade. They wore heavy leather overcoats infused with wax to repel the miasma, and their beaks were stuffed with aromatic herbs, cloves, cinnamon, and rose petals to drown out the smell of the dying. They moved through the streets like carrion birds themselves, poking the sick with long wooden canes to avoid physical contact. They were the physical manifestation of a world that had accepted the plague as a permanent neighbor. In the late 1490s, a feverish energy gripped the continent. In 1492, the Reconquista of Spain was completed as the last Moorish kingdom of Granada fell to Ferdinand and Isabella. In the same year, they made a gamble on a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus. He didn't find the spices of the East. He found a new world. But he brought the old world's ghosts with him. The same biological vulnerability that had decimated Europe was about to be unleashed on an unsuspecting hemisphere. The great mortality was no longer just a European memory. It was becoming a global export. When the first European ships touched the shores of the Americas, they carried with them a cocktail of diseases, smallpox, measles, and eventually the plague, that would do to the indigenous populations what Yersinia pestis had done to London and Paris, but on a scale that defied even the darkest medieval imagination. Back in Europe, the 15th century ended not with a whimper, but with a roar of religious and intellectual fire. In Florence, the monk Savonarola led the bonfire of vanities, where citizens threw their fine clothes, books, and paintings into the flames, a final desperate spasm of medieval guilt before the full light of the High Renaissance. The people were torn between the beauty of the new humanism and the terror of the old wrath. In a small town in Germany, a monk named Martin Luther was beginning to obsess over the same questions that had haunted the survivors of 1348. How can I be saved? Why does God strike the just and the unjust alike? The answers he would find, emphasizing faith over works and the Bible over the Pope, would finally shatter the unity of Christendom forever. The 14th century had been the crucible. The 15th century was the refining fire. By the year 1500, the age of the Middle Ages was officially over, replaced by an era of global empires, scientific inquiry, and religious warfare. But the DNA of that new world was inextricably linked to the catastrophe of the old. The Black Death had been the great leveler, the great teacher, and the great accelerator. It had taught humanity that the world was small, that the breath of a stranger could be a death sentence, and that when the structures of power fail, only the individual spirit remained. The bells that once tolled for the end of the world were now ringing for the birth of the modern age. In the end, the story of the Black Death is not a story of death at all. It is a story of resilience. It is the story of how a species, pushed to the very brink of extinction, managed to reinvent itself in the ruins. We are the descendants of those who didn't die. We carry their trauma, their skepticism, and their ambition in our very bones. The God have mercy on us, scrawled on a London door in 1348, is the ancestor of every medical journal and every satellite launch of the modern era, a testament to the fact that even when the sky falls, we find a way to stand back up.
The legacy of the Black Death did not merely end with a closing of a century. It settled into the foundations of the Western world like a permanent tectonic shift. By the early 1500s, the survivors' grandchildren had inherited a world that was physically emptier, but intellectually wider. The great mortality had been a brutal pruning, but the branches that remained were growing with a strange, frantic strength. In England, the death of feudalism was finalized not by decree, but by the relentless math of the marketplace. The tenant farmer, once a man whose very movements were owned by the lord of the manor, was now a free agent. This shift created a new kind of person, the individual. If the church couldn't explain the plague and the king couldn't stop it, then the only thing a man could truly rely on was his own conscience and his own labor. The new human landscape. The psychological scars of the 14th century eventually blossomed into the curiosity of the Renaissance. The obsession with the good death evolved into a hunger for a good life. The rise of the middle class, inherited wealth from deceased relatives, led to a massive influx of capital for commoners, fueling the demand for education and art. Technological acceleration. With fewer hands to work, the European mind turned toward machines. The printing press and advanced sailing vessels were direct responses to a world with a labor shortage. Scientific public health. The concept of miasma slowly gave way to the practical observation of contagion, leading to the birth of organized medicine and state-run health boards. The era of the plague taught humanity a terrifying, liberating truth. The universe was indifferent to rank, title, or piety. This realization didn't lead to the end of the world, as many had feared in 1348. Instead, it led to the birth of a world where human agency, the ability to study the stars, navigate the oceans, and challenge the status quo, became the primary driver of history. As the sun rose on the 16th century, the silence of the abandoned 14th century villages was replaced by the noise of the printing press and the roar of the Atlantic surf. The Black Death was the fire that forged the modern world, proving that even in the face of total catastrophe, the human story is not of endings, but of relentless, stubborn continuations. As the 16th century matured,
The specter of the Black Death did not vanish, it simply wore a new face. The terror of 1348 had evolved into a sophisticated, bureaucratic machinery of survival. In cities like London and Venice, the haphazard responses of the Middle Ages were replaced by bills of mortality, weekly reports that tracked every death in the parish. These were the world's first data sets, a grim ledger that allowed the state to watch the invisible enemy move through the streets in real time. This data-driven approach changed the nature of power. The king was no longer just a warrior judge, he was a protector of the body politic. When the plague returned, as it did with terrifying regularity, the response was now a coordinated lockdown of the economy. The closure of theaters in Shakespeare's London was a direct descendant of the quarantine protocols born in the 14th century lagoons of Venice. The artist, like the merchant, had to learn to create in the shadow of the scythe. The biological pivot. The most shocking legacy of the plague was not what it did to Europe, but what it enabled Europe to do to the rest of the world. Because the survivors of the Black Death and subsequent outbreaks had spent 2 centuries in a biological arms race with Yersinia pestis, smallpox, and the flu, their immune systems had become hardened, walking fortresses of antibodies. When these survivors crossed the oceans, they didn't just bring Bibles and gunpowder, they brought a biological cloud. The tragedy that had nearly ended European civilization became the very tool that enabled the rapid, often catastrophic conquest of the Americas. The great mortality was exported to a hemisphere that had no historical memory of such horrors, clearing the way for empires to rise on the graves of millions.
The final resolution. We often look back at the 14th century as a dark, alien time, but the people who walked those smoke-filled streets were achingly like us. They felt the same visceral weight of silence before a crisis. They felt the same betrayal when their leaders failed them. They felt the same desperate, beautiful urge to hold their children closer when the world outside turned cold. The Black Death was the ultimate stress test for the human experiment. It stripped away the fictions of the medieval world, the idea that the stars controlled our blood, or that a lord was made of different clay than a serf. In the vacuum left by the dead, the modern world rushed in. It was a world born of trauma, yes, but also of a new, fierce clarity. The resolution of the plague story is not a cure. The bacterium still exists today in the shadows of the earth, but a change in the human spirit. We learned that we are a single, interconnected biological community. We learned that knowledge is the only shield against the dark. And we learned that even after the thud of the bodies against the wall, the morning will eventually come, and with it, the chance to build something entirely new. The 17th century arrived with a cold, sharpening clarity. The transition from the medieval to the modern was not a smooth slope, but a jagged cliff. And in 1665, London faced its final, most brutal reckoning with the ancient enemy. This was the Great Plague, the last gasp of the Black Death's primary reign in England. By now, the city was a sprawling, chaotic metropolis of nearly 500,000 souls, a tinderbox of timber and filth waiting for a spark. When the spark came, it arrived in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields. The death was no longer a mystery to be blamed on the alignment of Saturn. It was an administrative crisis. The Lord Mayor issued orders that felt like a modern tactical manual. Every infected house was to be shut up, a red cross painted on the door with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," above it. Watchmen stood outside with halberds to ensure no one escaped. The silence that fell over London was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a tomb. Inside those locked houses, the human stakes reached their most agonizing peak. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, recorded the horror of hearing the cries of those trapped inside, the searchers prowling the streets with their white wands, and the dead carts rumbling through the night with the bellman's cry, "Bring out your dead." But even in this darkness, the scientific revolution was sharpening its tools. A young student at Cambridge named Isaac Newton was forced to flee the university and return to his family estate at Woolsthorpe to escape the contagion. In the enforced isolation of his plague year, he didn't succumb to despair. Instead, he watched an apple fall, contemplated the nature of light, and developed the calculus. The pandemic that had once shattered the human mind was now providing the quietude required for the greatest intellectual leaps in history. The Great Plague of London was finally extinguished not by medicine, but by fire. In 1666, the Great Fire of London tore through the city, incinerating the rat-infested slums and the medieval timber structures that had housed the pestilence for centuries. When the city was rebuilt, it was built of brick and stone, with wider streets and better drainage. The architectural ghost of the Middle Ages was burned away, making room for the Enlightenment. As we look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, the narrative arc of the Black Death reveals a profound, uncomfortable truth. We are not separate from the natural world. We are part of its complex, often violent choreography. The plague was a biological reset that dismantled a stagnant world and forced humanity to innovate or perish. It took the lives of millions, but it gave birth to the concepts of human rights, economic mobility, and scientific inquiry. The sound of boots on cobblestones today is different than it was in 1346. We no longer listen for the thud of bodies or the rattle of the dead cart, but the weight of that history remains. Every time we wash our hands, every time a government issues a health warning, every time we demand better wages or question an outdated authority, we are echoing the survivors of the 14th century. They were the ones who saw the end of the world and decided to build one in its place.
The story of the Black Death is the ultimate testament to human endurance. It is a reminder that even when the darkness seems absolute, the human spirit, obsessive, contradictory, and achingly resilient, will always find a way to strike a light. The 18th century brought the final fading tremors of the plague's long reign in Europe, most notably with the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720. But by then, the world was no longer the defenseless victim it had been in the 1340s. The Enlightenment had begun to dismantle the superstition of divine wrath, replacing it with the cold, clinical observation of the natural world. This shift in consciousness was the ultimate resolution of the era, a move from a world of fear to a world of understanding. In 1894, the ghost was finally given a name. During an outbreak in Hong Kong, Alexander Yersin, a student of Louis Pasteur, isolated the bacterium, Yersinia pestis. For 500 years, humanity had fought a war against an invisible god. Now they were fighting a microscopic organism. The mystery was gone, and with it, the plague's power to collapse civilizations. The modern resonance. The Black Death remains the most significant singular event in human history because it forced the species into a radical metamorphosis. Every pillar of modern Western life, capitalism, scientific inquiry, the value of the individual, and the secular state, is a flower that grew from the graveyard of the 14th century. We are not merely the survivors of the plague, we are its products. The haunting question that began this narrative, how does a society survive the end of its world, finds its answer in the granular details of the centuries that followed. Survival is not found in the grand decrees of kings or the prayers of popes, but in the stubborn, mundane choices of the living, the peasant who demands a fair wage, the printer who spreads a new idea, and the physician who records a data point. As the sun sets on this historical narrative, we see a world that is vastly more complex, more dangerous, and yet more hopeful than the one the Mongol trebuchets attacked at Caffa. The weight of silence before a battle or a pandemic still exists, but it is now met with the weight of 500 years of hard-won knowledge. The great mortality taught us that while we are fragile, we are also incredibly difficult to extinguish. The thud of the corpses against the walls of Caffa was the sound of an old world breaking. The scratch of a pen on parchment in a modern lab is the sound of that world continuing to heal.
The story of the Black Death is the ultimate testament to human endurance. It is a reminder that even when the darkness seems absolute, the human spirit, obsessive, contradictory, and achingly resilient, will always find a way to strike a light. The 18th century brought the final fading tremors of the plague's long reign in Europe, most notably with the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720. But by then, the world was no longer the defenseless victim it had been in the 1340s. The Enlightenment had begun to dismantle the superstition of divine wrath, replacing it with the cold clinical observation of the natural world. This shift in consciousness was the ultimate resolution of the era, a move from a world of fear to a world of understanding. In 1894, the ghost was finally given a name. During an outbreak in Hong Kong, Alexandra Yersin, a student of Louis Pasteur, isolated the bacterium Yersinia pestis. For 500 years, humanity had fought a war against an invisible god. Now they were fighting a microscopic organism. The mystery was gone, and with it, the plague's power to collapse civilizations. The modern resonance. The Black Death remains the most significant singular event in human history because it forced the species into a radical metamorphosis. Every pillar of modern Western life, capitalism, scientific inquiry, the value of the individual, and the secular state, is a flower that grew from the graveyard of the 14th century. We are not merely the survivors of the plague, we are its products. The haunting question that began this narrative, how does a society survive the end of its world, finds its answer in the granular details of the centuries that followed. Survival is found not in the grand decrees of kings or the prayers of popes, but in the stubborn, mundane choices of the living, the peasant who demands a fair wage, the printer who spreads a new idea, and the physician who records a data point. As the sun sets on this historical narrative, we see a world that is vastly more complex, more dangerous, and yet more hopeful than the one the Mongol trebuchets attacked at Caffa. The thud of the corpses against the walls of Caffa was the sound of an old world breaking. the scratch of a pen on parchment in a modern lab is the sound of that world continuing to heal. We are like dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants, wrote Bernard of Chartres. But perhaps after the 14th century, we are more like survivors standing on the ruins of a cathedral, using the fallen stones to build a house for everyone. The narrative of the Black Death concludes not with a final death, but with the definitive birth of the modern era. By the mid-18th century, the biological storm that had begun in the steppes of Central Asia and rained down upon the walls of Caffa had finally broken. Europe emerged not just as a survivor, but as a transformed entity, a civilization that had been forced to trade its medieval certainties for a restless, empirical pursuit of progress. In the final reckoning, the great mortality was the most expensive education humanity ever received. It taught the survivors that power was not a divine right, but a social contract, that wealth was not a fixed sum, but a product of labor, and that the invisible world was governed by laws of nature rather than the whims of a vengeful deity. The sound of the trebuchets at the beginning of this journey was the sound of a world shattering, but the silence at the end is the quiet, busy hum of a world being rebuilt by those who refused to let the darkness have the final word. The story ends here, but its echoes are everywhere. In the structure of our cities, the laws of our nations, and the very way we value a human life, we are still living in the world the plague created. Every time we confront a crisis with science instead of superstition, we honor the millions who died to teach us how. We are the legacy of the 14th century, scarred, skeptical, and undeniably, brilliantly alive. While the major waves of the great mortality subsided, the psychological and structural reconstruction of the West was just beginning. The 18th century served as the final transition point, where the echoes of the plague were codified into the very foundations of modern society. In the ports of the Mediterranean, the temporary lazarettos, the quarantine islands, became permanent stone structures. They were no longer just sites of frantic isolation, but symbols of a new state-sanctioned order. The plague had forced the hand of government. The state was now responsible for the health of its citizens. This shift gave rise to the concept of the social contract, the idea that the governed owe allegiance to a ruler only as long as that ruler provides security, not just against foreign armies, but against the invisible invaders of the blood. Simultaneously, the economic impact of the labor shortage reaching its final equilibrium led to the Industrial Revolution. In the English Midlands, the scarcity of hands that had begun in 1348 finally resulted in the mechanization of the textile industry. The spinning jenny and the power loom were the direct descendants of the 14th century labor crisis. Humanity had finally learned to use coal and iron to do the work that millions of lost souls used to perform by hand. The Black Death had inadvertently cleared the path for the black gold of the coal mines. The genetic legacy. Deep within our own biology, the story continues. Recent genetic studies of plague burial pits from London to Denmark have revealed that the survivors of the Black Death passed down specific protective mutations. A variant of the gene known as ERAP2 was found to be significantly more common in those who lived through the 14th century. This gene helped the immune system recognize and destroy Yersinia pestis more effectively. However, this biological armor came with a hidden cost. These same genetic markers are linked today to an increased risk of autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease. We are quite literally built from the scars of the 14th century. Our bodies are historical documents carrying the record of a war fought 700 years ago. As we reach the final resolution of this narrative, we find ourselves standing in a world that is the mirror image of the one that perished in 1346. Where the medieval world was collective, we are individualistic. Where they were fatalistic, we are proactive. Where they were stagnant, we are obsessed with growth. The Black Death was the great accelerator. It didn't invent the modern world, but it burned away the obstacles that stood in its way. It was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, yet it was also the crucible of our freedom. The sound of the bells that rang for the dead in the 1340s eventually became the bells of the universities, the stock exchanges, and the parliaments. The narrative of the Black Death is not a story of a disease, but a story of humanity's response to the impossible. We were not destroyed by the poisonous filth of Janabeg's trebuchets. We were transformed by it. We are the survivors, the heirs of a world that refused to die. And as we look back through the mist of 7 centuries, we can finally see that the darkness was not an end, but a beginning. The final act of this centuries-long drama shifted from the physical survival of the body to the intellectual survival of the species. By the mid-19th century, the great mortality had been demystified, yet its ghost remained the primary architect of the modern city. The winding, organic, and claustrophobic streets of the medieval era were being systematically replaced by the Haussmannization of Paris and the grid systems of New York and London. These were not just aesthetic choices, they were the ultimate defensive fortifications against the miasma that had haunted the human imagination since Caffa. In 1894, the chase finally ended in a makeshift laboratory in Hong Kong. Alexander Yersin, peering through a microscope into the fluid of a bubo, saw the rod-shaped bacterium that had toppled empires. He named it Pastorella pestis, later Yersinia pestis. The monster was no longer a shadow or a divine curse. It was a physical thing that could be measured, cultured, and eventually defeated with a vial of streptomycin. But as the biology was conquered, the cultural memory remained. The Black Death had ingrained a permanent survivalist instinct into Western civilization. It created a world that is fundamentally obsessed with progress, hygiene, and the mitigation of risk. We are the children of a catastrophe that lasted 400 years, and that trauma is woven into our obsession with the future. We don't just build for today, we build to outrun the next shadow. The story of the Black Death is a circle that never truly closes. Even now, in the laboratories of the 21st century, scientists study the ancient DNA found in the teeth of plague victims to understand how pathogens evolve. We are still learning from the dead of 1348. They are our greatest teachers in the art of resilience. As we look back at the figures that populated this narrative, the terrified Genoese sailors, the defiant peasants of 1381,
the obsessive scholars of the Enlightenment, and the grieving mothers of the 17th century, we see a mirror of ourselves. Their fears were ours, their moral failures were ours, and their stubborn, irrational hope is the reason we are standing here today.
The thud of a body hitting a dock in 1347 was the beginning of a long, dark night. But the sunrise that followed was the most brilliant in human history. The great mortality did not end the world, it simply made room for a new one. And that new world, with its flaws, its beauty, and its relentless pursuit of the light, is ours. The end of the plague's primary reign in the late 17th century did not mean the bacteria vanished into the ether. Rather, it retreated into the wild, into the burrows of marmots in the steppes and the rats of distant ports, waiting for the world to grow complacent. But the Europe it left behind was no longer a collection of isolated fiefdoms. It was a network of burgeoning nation-states that had learned through centuries of agonizing trial and error that the health of the beggar in the gutter was inextricably linked to the survival of the king in the palace. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the cordon sanitaire, the military enforced lines of isolation, became a standard tool of statecraft. When the plague struck the Austrian border or the ports of Prussia, the response was swift and absolute. Soldiers were stationed at intervals of every few hundred yards, authorized to shoot anyone attempting to cross the line. This was the dark, authoritarian underbelly of public health, the realization that to save the many, the state must be prepared to sacrifice the few. The individual's body was no longer their own. It was a property of the state's security apparatus. The technological leap. As the threat of the plague lingered, it continued to act as a silent partner to the Industrial Revolution. In the coal mines of Wales and the textile mills of Manchester, the drive to replace human labor with machines reached a fever pitch. The labor shortage that had begun in 1348 had never truly been solved. It had only been managed. The steam engine was the ultimate answer to the problem of a thinned-out population. If a machine could do the work of 100 men, then the caprice of a flea could no longer bring an economy to its knees. The final transition from the age of pestilence to the age of progress was marked by a shift in how we viewed our own mortality. The danse macabre, the skeletal dance of the 14th century, was replaced by the Victorian obsession with sanitation and the cult of domesticity. Death was moved out of the communal bedroom and into the sanitized, professionalized space of the hospital. The stink of the world that the chroniclers had described was finally being washed away by the birth of modern plumbing and the germ theory of disease. The final resolution, a world rebuilt. When we look at the legacy of the Black Death, we see a story of a civilization that was dismantled and then rebuilt piece by piece into something more resilient. The universal human stakes, survival, ambition, and the search for justice remained, but the tools used to address them had changed forever. Political power shifted from the divine right of kings to the social contract of health and security. Economic value shifted from the ownership of land to the ownership of labor and technology. Scientific thought shifted from the interpretation of signs to the observation of facts. The narrative of the Black Death is a thriller that happens to be true because it is the story of our own origins. We are the children of the great mortality. Every time we confront a global challenge, every time we demand transparency from those in power, and every time we use our collective intelligence to solve a crisis, we are drawing on the hard-won lessons of the 14th century. The thud of the corpses against the walls of Caffa was not the sound of a finale. It was the sound of a hammer striking an iron. The world was being broken so that it could be forged into something harder, sharper, and capable of reaching for the stars. The darkness was not a void, it was a womb, and the modern world was its difficult, miraculous birth. Historical fact check. While the Black Death killed upwards of 50% of the population in many regions, the resulting redistribution of wealth meant that for the first time in history, the average survivor had a caloric intake and a standard of living higher than almost any generation before them. It was a prosperity built on a foundation of bones, a moral complexity that the Renaissance poets and Enlightenment thinkers struggled to reconcile for centuries. The narrative of the Black Death does not conclude with a cure, but with a transformation of the human soul. By the dawn of the 19th century, the era of the great mortality had receded into the specialized ledgers of history, yet its influence remained the primary architect of the modern world. The terror that began in 1347 had forced a fundamental renegotiation of the human contract with God, with the state, and with nature itself. In the final centuries of the plague cycle, the response of the Western world moved from the spiritual to the systemic. The establishment of permanent health boards and the rigorous enforcement of maritime quarantine were the first instances of a state claiming total authority over the movement of its citizens in the name of safety. This was the birth of the administrative state, a world where your right to travel, to trade, and to gather was mediated by the health of the collective. The plague had inadvertently taught the West that freedom is a luxury afforded only by the stability of the public health. As the medical world finally closed in on Yersinia pestis in the laboratories of Hong Kong and Paris, the economic engine fueled by the post-plague labor shortage reached its zenith. The scarcity of human hands that had once paralyzed the feudal lords had become the primary driver of the Industrial Revolution. The steam engine, the spinning jenny, and the telegraph were not merely inventions of genius, they were the ultimate solutions to the problem of a thinned-out population. Humanity had finally learned to use the energy of the earth to do the work that millions of lost souls used to perform by hand.
The resolution of the Black Death is found in the paradox of its legacy. It was the greatest tragedy in human history, yet it was also the catalyst for the greatest period of human advancement. It destroyed the old world so completely that a return to the status quo was impossible. In its wake, it left a society that was more literate, more mobile, and more skeptical of authority, a society that valued the living more because it had seen so much of the dead.
The thud of the bodies against the cobblestones of Caffa in 1346 was the sound of a foundation cracking. But the world we live in today is the structure built upon those ruins. Every time we confront a global crisis with reason instead of panic, every time a laborer demands a fair share of the profit, and every time a scientist peers into the microscopic dark to find a light, we are proving that the Black Death did not win. It only changed the rules of the game. The Great Mortality was not an ending. It was the brutal, agonizing, and ultimately triumphant prologue to the modern age. We are the survivors. We are the legacy. We are the reason the story continues. The transition from the 19th to the 20th century saw the plague lose its status as a supernatural terror and become a manageable variable in the new science of epidemiology. The discovery of the flea as the primary vector for Yersinia pestis by Paul Louis Simond in 1898 was the final piece of the puzzle. It turned the medieval nightmare into a problem of urban sanitation. The poisonous filth that the Genoese chroniclers feared was no longer an invisible vapor from the stars, but a physical creature living in the fur of a rodent. This shift in understanding completed the secularization of the Western mind. In the 1340s, the only response to the plague was to kneel. By the 1900s, the response was to build better sewers, mandate garbage collection, and develop antibiotics. This was the ultimate victory of the survivors. They had moved the theater of battle from the soul to the laboratory. The economic legacy was equally profound. The post-plague labor shortage had permanently elevated the value of human work. By the turn of the century, the labor movements that had begun as whispers in the alehouses of 1381 had become the organized unions and social democracies of the modern era. The realization that society could not function without the cooperation of the lower orders was a direct inheritance from the demographic collapse of the Middle Ages. The modern middle class was not an accident. It was a biological byproduct of the Black Death. The genetic echo chamber. Today, we carry the plague in our DNA more than we realize. Geneticists have discovered that the selective pressure of the Black Death was so intense that it altered the frequency of immune system genes in the European population within a single generation. This bottleneck effect means that every person of European descent is the offspring of someone who possessed a specific high-functioning immune response to Yersinia pestis. However, this evolutionary triumph has a dark side. The same genetic hypervigilance that saved our ancestors from the buboes is now suspected of contributing to the modern epidemic of autoimmune disorders. Our bodies are still fighting a war that ended centuries ago. We are over-engineered for a world of pathogens that we have largely neutralized through hygiene and medicine. As we close this narrative, the true resolution becomes clear. The Black Death was not a detour in human history. It was the engine. It was the moment humanity was forced to grow up, to stop looking to the heavens for permission, and to start looking at the earth for answers. It was a tragedy of nearly 200 million lives, but it produced a world that values life more than any that came before it. The thud of the corpses at Caffa in 1346 was the sound of the old world's heart stopping. The silence of a modern city at night is the sound of the new world breathing. We are the survivors. We are the story. And we are the evidence that no matter how dark the night, the dawn is inevitable. The end of Part 1. Summary of the narrative journey. The spark, the biological warfare at the siege of Caffa, 1346. The spread, the maritime journey to Sicily and the collapse of the Mediterranean. The social rupture, the failure of the church, the rise of the flagellants, and the persecution of minorities. The economic pivot, the death of serfdom, and the rise of the laboring class leverage. The political evolution, the peasants' revolt of 1381, and the shift toward the social contract. The intellectual rebirth, the Renaissance, the printing press, and the scientific revolution as a response to catastrophe. The modern legacy, how our biology, our laws, and our cities are still defined by a 14th century flea. The narrative now moves from the macro history of shifting empires to the microscopic and intimate transformation of the human psyche. By the 18th century, the great mortality had ceased to be a recurrent nightmare and had become a foundation for a new kind of human dignity. The labor shortage that began in 1348 had permanently tilted the scales. A human life was now too expensive to be treated as a mere expendable resource of the land. This economic reality birthed the concept of the standard of living. For the first time, the survivors' descendants expected more than just survival. They expected comfort. In the cities of the Enlightenment, this manifested in the creation of the first true middle-class homes. These were spaces designed for privacy, for the individual, and for the family unit. Moving away from the communal, crowded hovels of the medieval era, where the plague had feasted with such ease. But as the physical plague receded, it left behind a cultural hypervigilance. The Western world became obsessed with the concept of cleanliness. This wasn't just about soap, it was a moral imperative. To be clean was to be civilized. To be dirty was to be a carrier of death. This obsession drove the engineering of the modern world. The vast, subterranean brick cathedrals of the London sewers, designed by Joseph Bazalgette in the 1960s, were the ultimate monuments to the trauma of the 14th century. They were the physical realization of the ancient prayer, "God have mercy on us," translated into iron and mortar.
The resolution of the Black Death story is found in the way we now look at a single, individual human life. In 1346, a body launched by a trebuchet was merely filth. By the 20th century, that same body was a repository of rights, a subject of medical study, and a member of a global community. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the idea that people were nameless. We are now at the end of the narrative arc. We have traveled from the salt-sprayed walls of a Crimean fortress to the sanitized digital world of the present. We have seen the stars blamed, the Jews massacred, the church humbled, and the scientist exalted. We have watched the world end, and we have watched it begin again. The historical record is clear. The Black Death was the most significant biological event in human history.
It was a tragedy of 200 million people, but it was also the forge of our modernity. Every time we argue for higher wages, every time we benefit from a life-saving vaccine, and every time we exercise our right to speak against power, we are acting as the heirs of those who survived the great mortality. The thud of the bodies has stopped. The bells no longer toll in fear, but the story remains, a 100% true thriller of survival, written in our blood and carved into our world. The final reverberation of the Black Death was not a physical sickness, but a revolution of the human spirit that we now call the Enlightenment. By the late 1700s, the great mortality had been relegated to the annals of history, yet its influence was the invisible hand shaping the modern world. The labor shortage that began in 1348 had never truly abated. It had simply forced humanity to become more clever. Because there were fewer hands to work the earth, the survivors' descendants invented machines to do it for them. This shift was most visible in the rise of the standard of living. For the first time in human history, the average person expected more than just a crust of bread and a roof that didn't leak. They expected agency. This newfound leverage led to the birth of the individual, a person defined not by their place in a divine hierarchy, but by their own labor and their own mind. The peasant who stood defiantly before his lord in the 1350s was the direct ancestor of the citizen who demanded a constitution in the 1780s. But as the world grew brighter, it also grew more clinical. The stink of the world that had haunted the medieval chroniclers was finally addressed by the Great Stink of 1858 in London. The response was a marvel of Victorian engineering, the creation of a massive subterranean sewer system that mirrored the complexity of the city above. This was the final, physical victory over the plague's primary vector. By separating the living from their waste, humanity finally broke the cycle of filth and flea that had reigned for centuries. The resolution of the Black Death is found in our very DNA. Scientists have discovered that the survivors of the 14th century passed down specific immune system markers like the gene variant ERAP2, which helped them recognize and destroy Yersinia pestis. While this saved our ancestors, it also left us with a legacy of autoimmune sensitivity. We are in a very literal sense built from the carnage of the Middle Ages. Our bodies are living museums of a war that ended 700 years ago. The narrative arc that began with a wet thud on a Crimean pier ends in the sanitized digital halls of the modern world. We have traveled through fire, famine, and the literal end of the world to arrive at a place where the life of a single human is considered more valuable than the ego of a king. The plague didn't just kill, it pruned. It burned away the dead wood of feudalism and allowed the seeds of the modern age to grow.
The story of the Black Death is the story of us. It is 100% true, completely unbelievable, and yet entirely human. Every time we confront a global crisis with data instead of dread, every time we demand better wages or better health, and every time we use our minds to conquer the dark, we are proving that the survivors of Caffa were right to keep rowing. They didn't just survive the plague, they survived so that we could build the world that finally defeated it. The narrative of the Black Death concludes not with a final death, but with the definitive birth of the modern era. By the mid-19th century, the biological storm that had begun in the steppes of Central Asia and rained down upon the walls of Caffa had finally broken. Europe emerged not just as a survivor, but as a transformed entity, a civilization that had been forced to trade its medieval certainties for a restless, empirical pursuit of progress. In the final reckoning, the great mortality was the most expensive education humanity ever received. It taught the survivors that power was not a divine right, but a social contract, that wealth was not a fixed sum, but a product of labor, and that the invisible world was governed by the laws of nature rather than the whims of a vengeful deity. The sound of the trebuchets at the beginning of this journey was the sound of a world shattering, but the silence at the end is the quiet, busy hum of a world being rebuilt by those who refused to let the darkness have the final word. The biological resolution. The hunt for the invisible killer finally ended in 1894. During a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, two researchers, Alexander Yersin and Shibasaburo Kitasato, independently identified the pathogen. It was later named Yersinia pestis. By isolating the pathogen, humanity moved from a world of mystical fear to a world of clinical action. We finally understood that the enemy wasn't a curse from the heavens, but a microscopic life form hitching a ride on fleas and rats. The lasting architecture of society. The structural changes forced by the plague became the bedrock of our modern lives. The labor shortages of the 14th century eventually led to the mechanization of industry. Because human life had become so precious and labor so expensive, we built machines to do the work that millions of lost souls once performed by hand. Public health. The temporary quarantine islands of Venice became the permanent health boards of modern nations. Economic mobility. The death of feudalism allowed for the rise of a middle class with the capital to fund the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. The individual. The collapse of blind faith in institutions forced a shift towards humanism and the value of personal conscience. The story of the Black Death is the ultimate testament to human endurance. It is a reminder that even when the darkness seems absolute, the human spirit, obsessive, contradictory, and achingly resilient, will always find a way to strike a light. We are the survivors. Every time we wash our hands, every time we demand a fair wage, and every time we use science to solve a crisis, we are echoing the voices of those who rode away from Caffa 700 years ago, refusing to let the story end in the dark. The final resolution of the great mortality wasn't found in a treaty or a single medical breakthrough, but in the slow, permanent hardening of the human spirit and the radical redesign of the world itself. By the early 20th century, the era of the plague as a civilization-ending threat had finally been silenced by the arrival of antibiotics. However, the world that remained was the house that the plague built. The labor crisis that began in 1348 reached its ultimate conclusion with the rise of the state as guardian. No longer could a king simply rule by divine right. He had to ensure the biological survival of his subjects. This shift led to the first modern sewer systems, the regulation of food, and the mandate of public education, all designed to prevent the filth of the Middle Ages from ever returning. The modern biological inventory. Even today, we are walking archives of 1348. The biological pruning that occurred 7 centuries ago changed us at the cellular level.
This concludes the narrative of the Black Death, the Great Mortality, the genetic shield. Modern Europeans and their descendants often carry specific alleles that helped their ancestors survive Yersinia pestis. The cost of immunity. Scientists now investigate whether this same hyperactive immune system, which once fought off the plague, is responsible for the modern rise in Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis. The epidemiological blueprint. The way we respond to modern pandemics, using mathematical modeling, contact tracing, and central health reporting, is the direct evolution of the bills of mortality first tallied in the plague-choked parishes of London. Final reflection. The forge of modernity. The story of the Black Death is a thriller that happens to be true. It began with a wet thud of a body against a wooden pier in the Crimea, and ended with the human race realizing that we are a single, interconnected community. It taught us that catastrophe is the greatest accelerator of change. It broke the chains of serfdom, shattered the monopoly of the church on knowledge, and forced the human mind to look at the world through the lens of evidence rather than superstition. The death of the Middle Ages was the birth of the individual. The thud of the corpses has stopped. The bells no longer toll in fear. But every time we demand better working conditions, every time we benefit from a life-saving vaccine, and every time we use our collective intelligence to solve a global crisis, we are drawing on the hard-won resilience of the 14th century. We are the descendants of those who rode away from the darkness, and we carry their light forward.